Hello, my name is Ian Hendy and I'm CEO of Hendy Consulting Limited, the specialist management consulting firm to the $125 billion FPD display market. And I thank Ross and the guys at the SEC for inviting me again to speak at this business conference under the analyst section. I found in the last 10 years of public speaking on displays that the things that people like the most are actually the most simple ones. So today I just wanted to take us on a walk through the top 6 display players and their business strategies in the display market. And because they represent fully 80% of the display market revenue, that understanding these 6 players would be very useful for everybody as background, particularly people that are new to the industry recently or haven't kept up on things that have happened in the Korean and Chinese strategies in particular. So what we're going to talk about is the following 6 players. The top 2 players in China, where BOE is by far the biggest capacity player in the total industry. And China Star is perhaps the scrappy little brother, but actually I quite like the China Star business strategy. It's more narrow, more focused, and in a way more discriminating in terms of their approach to the marketplace. Then we're going to talk about the 2 Korean brothers. So the larger brother is Samsung Display Corp and the current industry number 1 in the industry on a revenue basis, and LG Display is the younger brother in that case. Finally, and I love this picture of 2 Asian boys, I have a half Asian son myself, the 2 Taiwanese that I call the Taiwanese twins. And that's because at a 30,000 foot view, those 2 businesses are incredibly similar. And so I wanted people to see them that way and perhaps think of them that way when they think about the marketplace. So the top 6 businesses now represent between 71% and 80% of total industry revenue. And there's been an interesting move up and down the leadership board over the last 2 years. When LCD prices were high in 2021, then we see that BOE was fully the revenue leader. And that place it's actually lost back to Samsung Display Corp in 2022 when pricing, as we know, came crashing back down again. But it does indeed look like the top 6 are consolidating their revenue position across the industry. So from 2018, where they started at 71%, now through 2022 at fully 80% of the marketplace. So this is what we're going to discuss. We're going to talk about the top 2 Chinese, the top 2 Koreans, and then the top 2 Taiwanese. And I hope you find that interesting. So when I talk about the display players, I often use chess pieces as my idea. BOE is simply the king of China, and they are the largest in terms of total capacity. But I tend to refer to them as technology agnostic. That is, they are trying to do almost everything. They have been the shipment leader in the past, and particularly when LCD pricing was high, that led to the number 1 revenue position. China Star then is a slightly smaller player, and I always consider them to be slightly more technologically focused in their business strategy. And they've actually made more strong forward-looking bets in terms of the large panel emissive play that they want to make than BOE have done so far. And I actually quite like the China Star business strategy when I look at them from a distance. So if you look at these 2 players in China, what you can learn about them is they are both very heavily invested into LCD. So as the Koreans have run for the exit, the market share of BOE and China Star, particularly since both have made acquisitions at the bottom of the cycle last time, are further increasing their share in LCD. They basically can be seen as broad merchant players across the whole LCD space. They have Gen 8 and Gen 10 facilities, and they are both very large. And then what's really interesting is this pattern where you get one player that's very strong in Flex OLED. In this place, it's BOE, and then China Star, who's made more of an impression on working on their large panel emissive strategy through inkjet printing. So this pattern we're going to see across the Chinese and the Koreans. And so, yeah, here it is. I mean, I just wanted to show that pattern is often the case. So this is the top 2 Koreans that we're going to look at next, Samsung Display Corp and LGD. And you've got the same pattern where SDC is strong in one technology, as in the Flex OLED play, and LGD is very strong in white OLED for television. And I think that's because the amount of effort it takes to truly succeed at a technology as difficult as that, including the capex implications and the technology implications, is actually very high. And so people tend to lead to putting one first then the other. BOE is simply bigger than China Star in Flex OLED, and alternatively, China Star seems to have made a little bit more progress in making their choices on future large panel emissive bets. So first, what you should remember about the two of them in terms of their LCD position. I mean, they're both huge. BOE now has more than 80 million square meters, and China Star back in the mid 50s. That includes the fabs that they've picked up from CEC Panda or from Samsung when Samsung ran for the door in LCD. And so what you should just realize is those numbers are very large. We'll compare them later, and for example, AUO and Innolux are in the 30 million square meter range, and so you can see that these numbers then commensurately are very, very large. When you then turn to Flex OLED, this is what I was talking about, where BOE is simply larger currently now, and also in terms of forward-looking aspiration in Flex OLED, and they have a real business intent to try and gain Apple's attention and business as almost the second supplier to SDC. And they've been trying very hard to get the technology to work in low temp polyoxide to sit at the high end of Apple's range for AMOLED for smartphone. They have the capacity, 3 major fabs, one of which is dedicated for Apple, and they are pushing very hard to be an important supplier there. Whereas China Star, I think, lagged into the space. They have invested to get there, but not quite where BOE is at. Similarly, then you can switch that around and say, well, now here's the pattern that I expect to see, which is China Star then is probably, I would say, further forward in actually talking about their forward-looking strategy for a large panel emissive television. And their strategy is to pick up on inkjet printing. So they're one of the companies that's probably in the world the most advanced in terms of understanding inkjet printing for industrial use. They previously had a collaboration with JOLED. I'd be interested to see what form that's in now that the engineers are working for JDI, but I assume they will carry on trying to use Japanese technology to try and get into large panel emissive television, and that's quite a technology bet. That's almost the same size as LGD moving into white OLED or SDC moving into QD-OLED. It's a real ballsy move by China Star. I think BOE got first into the microdisplay space way before others. It's had a small company in China doing AMOLED on silicon for quite a long time, and as far as I know, China Star hasn't moved in that direction. Probably you could say that BOE predated even Samsung Display Corp's recent interest in that space. And what I think I want people to remember about BOE's strategy here, and this is from one of their own previous strategy slides, is just if you look across here into LCD and OLED, they basically cover all of it. They've also got real interest then into downstream ecosystems, and that's something we're going to see also with the Taiwanese when we get to studying them later. So BOE and the Taiwanese also have interests in moving downstream into providing complete electronic systems. So this is the summary then of the top 2 Chinese. I call BOE the elephant because they're large and very powerful. I certainly don't mean to say they're slow, because they actually build factories very, very quickly. I also call them vanilla in that I want to get across this idea that they choose to do everything. Vanilla to me is an ice cream I love, but it's sort of the one that pleases everyone. And in a way, they're trying to be a fast follower to every display technology. China Star then in a way is being, I think, a little bit more strategically focused in making a major thrust around large panel emissives. And in general, like for like, if you study the two businesses over time, I think China Star takes a more narrow focus and I think more clever decision making in terms of what they pursue. So that's the Chinese summary. So the first pair is the Chinese pair. It has BOE at the head, and little brother is China Star, but they're both actually very big, very serious businesses, and I actually think China Star long term could be a very important player to the industry. BOE too, but I'd like to see them make some actual innovations through their own technology and or discriminating bets in what they choose to do. So now let's talk about the top 2 Koreans, and I'm sure most of the people in the audience know these two very well, but let's talk about their forward-looking business strategies too, which maybe has been less announced. So I was amazed by this talk by JS Chair from SDC at IMID at the end of last summer, where he talked about a really expansionary vision for SDC. He basically talked about a future where emissive displays were $100 billion, and he wants SDC to be fully half of that. Now, if you think that they're a $25 billion firm now, getting to $50 billion is a doubling in their revenue, and I think that's really quite an impressive feat. It would be, and to get there, you have to really think about major expansions of business domain, and that's exactly actually what he's talking about. So here, this is SDC and LGD. And what we're going to do is talk through each one of the discriminating 8 levers here. Both companies are running for the door on LCD, but SDC got there first. We've got the same pattern where one is strong in Flex OLED, and that's Samsung Display Corp, where LGD has the premium position in white OLED, but there's an interesting story to tell there. Then we've got yet another one of those bets being played out, with SDC being absolutely the category leader for foldables in the marketplace. And LGD is actually making its new bet a push into transparent OLEDs, and I have my reservations about that, which I'll talk about. But where they're actually both completely in line is the future investments into large Gen 8.6. Now I think we hear, I'm sure Ross will update us, OLED fine metal mask facilities for Apple, for notebooks and monitors, that sort of thing, iPads, which will be based on probably some sort of tight equipment supplier relationship with either someone like Canon Toki or Sunic in Korea, but around large gen glass for fine metal mask OLED. And also I think the automotive industry should be finally happy that both players are talking about automotive OLED and a serious play in that. So they've both been running for the exit in terms of LCD, but Samsung beat LGD to the punch and got out first. I was actually very surprised that they were already out as of the end of Q2 last year. Whereas from what I hear, LGD is still trying to find its pathway to exit, with its fab in China still one up for discussion about how to get that to a offloaded from them. And I think you'll see later it becomes one of their execution challenges. Now, in the Flex OLED space, SDC is the dominant leader with more than 65% market share, and LGD just distinctly trails here. SDC sets the market, they define the value-added strategy, they set the specifications and the forward-looking roadmap, and I've actually published quite a lot on their strategy because I find it so absolutely fascinating. Here you really have one company setting the agenda for the whole industry, and they've been talking about a range of innovations that basically increase the value capture in their displays. And then in the TV space, this is when it's then flipped around, right? This same pattern where LGD is 7-1 ahead of SDC in terms of capacity for a large panel emissive. And actually beyond that, it gets more interesting that there's actually a discussion on the table whether Samsung Electronics and the LG group will get together over some collaboration on white OLED. So there may be a semi-protectionist help out Korea, help out Samsung deal that's on the table, where Samsung Electronics ends up with both white OLED and QD OLED within its pantheon. That deal is back on the table. And certainly, this is going to be an interesting one to watch. But I love the QD OLED product. Its color space is absolutely amazing. Then we get into a business issue where we've got two separate categories, where in one SDC dominates, and that is absolutely the foldables category, and then LGD could arguably claim that they claim rollables, at least in terms of television, but I don't think they've pushed that hard in terms of units. And LGD's big push is into transparent OLED, and this was actually originally a Samsung idea back a decade and a half. But LGD is actually taking that up now. And my only concern with this is it needs to be delivered through a B2B sort of value-added retailer supply chain. And actually quite a lot of market work needs to be done to push through these volumes. And I think that's actually what makes it a more difficult strategy than some of the others are to execute. So then now we're going to go talk about large format fine metal mask OLED, and I'm sure Ross will give an update on what's finally been decided. This has swung around between the substrate size that's been under consideration, and the last business press I've seen out of Korea was actually for a Gen 8.6 factory, not Gen 8.7. So I think they're fine-tuning their substrate choices, but this is a major investment by both companies into large fine metal mask OLED processing, probably using half-cut. But it will revolutionise the degree to which OLED in IT panels is deployed. What they both are doing, and this should be very big news to the automotive industry, is both players are now being very serious about AMOLED for automotive. And I think for a long time, automotive designers have been saying, well, when will they take us seriously in terms of our business? Well, I think the answer is now. And so I think this will be very good news for the automotive marketplace in terms of really getting serious on supply of AMOLEDs for automotive. And the other interesting decision for me was JS Chair was then pushing the idea that they're going to make a strategic choice fairly soon on their micro display position. He also talked about this as the crossover marketplace between displays and semiconductors, and that Samsung in particular was particularly well positioned to do this given their background in both displays and semiconductors. And I actually quite believe him in that, but whether they will pull that off, that will be a really interesting one to follow. So then I want to talk a little bit about, my thesis is the LG and the Samsung display businesses in the future look more similar. But then let's talk about where they are today. And the reality is there is an execution gap between SDC and LGD. If you look at the profitability for the last 2 years, SDC has simply been ahead. We could have argued before the exit from LCD at the end of Q2 2022 that then there was a mix gap perhaps defined by the scale difference in Flex OLED. But after that, you can almost say that there's an LCD anchor that has pulled LGD down further, deeper into losses, as Samsung no longer was in the space, but LGD was still there. And so I think you've got this, as I showed, the little circular diagram on the top right, LGD execution gap, where because they started as being slightly smaller in scale in Flex OLED, and LCD pricing was so heavily in decline between 21 and 22, and indeed because OLED TV of itself, I think the best that LGD has shown is that it can be a break-even or very slightly profitable business, and even that was after depreciation runoff. In general, for now, the QD OLED product I would expect to be unprofitable. I mean, it's a very expensive architecture. So you've got these differences in mix, and then the fact that LGD left LCD later, just as the prices came crashing down, that's defining what I would call an execution gap. If you look forward, I say the businesses, I think, strategically are becoming more aligned, at least in terms of their aspirations to large investments in OLED facilities for Gen 8 plus fine metal mask and automotive bets. So they are similar going forward. I just hope and worry that LGD will have the funds to be able to make those investments. The story of the display industry is you execute badly one cycle, you fall behind and can't make the investments for the next stage, and that damages your business materially. And that's what I'm hoping isn't the case with LGD. So this is then the story of the two Koreans. You've got SDC, which arguably is the industry's by far biggest innovator. They've created ecosystems for new display technologies more than anybody else. They have a fundamental capability at equipment innovation and practical innovations that lead to beneficial technologies. I would argue that looking forward, the businesses begin to look more similar in terms of their strategic bets. Yes, there are some differences, but some of the bets are the same. And yet there is this execution gap. So I go, well, just despite the role of strategy, there is definitely still a role of execution. And I am worried that LGD now has been caught with an LCD anchor just in terms of bad timing. So finally then, and we're moving on to the last pairing, and then we're going to talk about the top two Taiwanese. And they are so similar at 30,000 feet that I've called them the Taiwanese twins. So this is the top leadership board of the industry, and I think we've discussed now numbers 1 through 4 in doing the top Chinese and the top Koreans. Actually, numbers 5 and 6 are AUO, which is the leading Taiwanese firm, and then Innolux. And so now we'll talk about the Taiwanese twins. So this is where, frankly, the story is only about degree. They're actually both very similar in terms of their exposure in square meters of capacity to the LCD market, neither of which have been able to make a substantive investment into Flex OLED, although they've both played with the technology a lot. And then you only get to, I would argue, that AUO is a little ahead both in OLED and in micro-LED R&D. But these two firms are making micro-LED absolutely their future in terms of an innovation strategy, because they probably don't have the money to be able to follow in OLED. The numbers are simply too big. And then what you'll see is both Taiwanese, however, are interested in downstream businesses. And I would argue again, AUO on the margin is a little bit stronger than Innolux, but they are both very, very similar. And this came up, and this is not what I expected, but actually if you calculate it, they both come out at very, very close to 30 million square meters each. So remember that BOE was in the 80s and China Star was in the 50s. These are the two Taiwanese twins, and they are both still in LCD, but they're both about the same size. They're both becoming somewhat IT and automotive specialists. They're both very good at that. They're both very strong merchant suppliers. They're good at handling customers. And I think that holds them well, but they are now relatively smaller. I mean, even HKC, if you count the total of their capacity, and that's a tier 2 from China, is 38 million square meters already. So, you know, the fact that they've been constrained in this space by lack of ability to raise money in the capital markets around a expansionary story that the bankers believe is leaving the two Taiwanese twins left open looking at micro-LED predominantly. Now, it is worth saying they both are amazing at automotive displays. I think these are among two of the leaders, and I think that's something you should remember about both of them. In OLED, I would argue that AUO is a little ahead, given they had an inkjet print R&D capability in OLED, but both have looked into OLED displays at different times, and they've both dabbled with the technology, definitely. It's then when we get into micro-LED where I would argue again that AUO is a little ahead, only here in that they are actually in the supply chain for the backplanes for the Samsung Electronics The Wall type project. So they're actually established in what is one of the probably major businesses in micro-LED today, and they're both working like crazy on automotive demonstrators because the fit with micro-LED into automotive is just very nice. Strategically, price-wise, product fit, it's a very good fit for the future. And then it is interesting, I mean, you can pull these off the website of both firms. Both businesses are, like BOE, really interested in doing downstream system integration into a range of businesses using their LCDs as part of device systems. And I think you could argue that AUO is a little stronger, but they're both very similar. So then that's what I wanted to take away from it, and this is why I called them the Taiwanese twins. Is that I feel they're actually very similar. They both have about 30 million square meters of capacity. You can argue back and forth about who is slightly ahead in each of OLED and micro-LED, and indeed the downstream businesses. But actually I would argue, compared to the others, these two are actually very similar companies. So fine. This then becomes the summary overall and what I wanted people to understand from my review of the top 6 companies in the industry. The two Chinese is a big brother, smaller brother, where I would argue BOE is very large, capacity leader, interested in everything, all technologies. As far as I know, hasn't made a large panel emissive bet yet. China Star, a little more discriminating and interested in inkjet printing as their forward-looking emissive strategy. The Koreans, my thesis is their forward-looking strategy decisions are becoming more and more alike, yet their starting point right now is an execution gap where I think LGD ended up leaving LCD a little late and then got weighed down with the implications of running losses when the prices came down in LCD. Certainly that's probably impacted their ability to fund the forward-looking investments that they want to. And so then going forward, will LGD be able to keep pace with SDC on the big investments into Gen 8 plus fine metal mask OLED fabs that are on the slate now? And then, so I would actually claim that beyond strategy, SDC has simply executed better. The position they ended up in with this large share in Flex OLED has left SDC in a very strong situation. And then finally the Taiwanese twins, which at 30,000 feet, they look incredibly similar. So that's then the top 6. Most presenters like to talk about their businesses up front, but I'm going to do mine at the end. And that is really just to talk about the differences between market research and DSEC, Omdia and Yole in their micro-led coverage, to me, are the best 3 in this space. And if you're trying to explore business questions around how big is a marketplace, what is current pricing or shipment levels, what are the trends in foldable displays, and which factories are being built and with which equipment, then that's the sort of thing where primary market research is exactly the right answer for you. Go to one of those 3 firms, and I can help you do that, but purchase reports that are produced on a multi-client basis that answer those questions. Where Hendy Consulting gets involved, and we're one of the very few firms that does this, is advising general managers who have display technology businesses, be that materials, be that equipment, be that novel display approaches, on moving forward and how do they maximize the value of their businesses. So, for example, the question, is this technology any good? How would you review it, and what are the weaknesses, and how would I improve this in marketplace? That is something we would do. So we would come to you if necessary, or by video conference, and explore those issues. If you want to get into a discussion of how do I set up a joint development agreement with the display industry that fairly apportions value between what I'm bringing and what the display company is providing, then again, that is something we do. Partnering with the display industry, choosing which of the display firms that you should work with, those are questions we answer. We also get involved because of work that I was involved in, and some of my collaborators have been involved in earlier in our careers in planning fabs inside LGD. We learnt an awful lot about the fab economic modelling, and so whether you should think about building new factories either as a LCD fab or as a component maker building a factory towards something in the display industry. And then finally, we answer questions like, how can I position myself for success in the display marketplace? And we have a retainer growth program that we work with GMs of display startups and businesses to help them succeed. So I just want to give you a characterization that there's actually a difference in the role of the companies here in answering some of these questions. And, from my own point of view, Hendy Consulting has actually covered, we've worked with over 70 clients to date across a huge range of technology discussions, but also a range of different assignment types. And you should see us as a broad capability to be able to come in and help solve your business problem. So finally then for today, it's been a little bit of a race through the top 6, but what I wanted to do was give you a characterization of the top 6 businesses in the display industry. In China, it is BOE, who is the absolute bigger child, with huge capacity, huge reach, building factories like crazy. But I would argue that they're choosing to take a fast follower approach to all strategy decisions, whereas China Star, I think, has been a little bit more discriminating. In Korea, the debate for me is between the 2 brothers, SDC and LGD, where SDC ended up with a better mix and moved faster to OLED, which has created an execution gap against LGD. I would argue their forward-looking strategy decisions actually look more similar, but this execution gap may have consequences for LGD. And then finally, I wanted to talk about the Taiwanese twins, just because they are so incredibly similar as the 2 companies. And from 30,000 feet, they actually look very similar. Beyond that, as Hendy Consulting and on my own page, Ian Hendy on LinkedIn, I publish content like this on an almost daily basis, and I look forward if anybody would like to continue to follow the stream of thinking and to engage with business thinking on these matters, for people to do it there. Thank you very much.